G'day listeners, this is Michael Landman, and I've just had a lot of fun recording the preface to the Interdisciplinary Handbook of Perceptual Control Theory, Volume 2. And as you can hear, someone's handed me the keys to a recording studio where I have access to a number of sound effects at my disposal. I try to limit my use of these, but sometimes I guess I'm more effective than others. A few moments to introduce myself, who I am, where I am, and why I've decided to record this, but in the spirit of giving you as much control over your listening experience, please skip to 2 minutes 30 if you wish to jump straight into the preface. So my name is Michael Landman, soon to be a PhD student at Curtin University, Perth, Western Australia. I encountered PCT last year under the supervision of Professor Warren Mansell whilst undertaking my honours thesis. And throughout my honours thesis, I found the consumption of academic material, specifically PCT, through audio platforms like that of the interviews provided by Tom Schultz on Spotify, incredibly valuable to my rapid consumption of perceptual control theory, and it was really handy to grapple with that and really make the most of my time in a year that was quite time in a year where I was quite time poor. And I don't think this is only the experience of honours students. I think this is more basically how people experience the world at the moment. And this isn't a replacement for reading the books and the wonderful resources out there, but it's absolutely a potential window into what's out there, and I hope that it serves some students now and students into the future. So I would also like to really thank the editors and authors of this handbook for enabling me to try my hand at this form of dissemination and expression. It isn't perfect, but it is a start. Here goes. Preface. During the summer of 2020, as the COVID-19 crisis was reaching a peak, the Interdisciplinary Handbook of Perceptual Control Theory was published. The book was initiated and dedicated to Bill Powers, the developer of PCT, who had passed away on the 24th of May 2013. In his chapter in the volume, he had stated, "We are now facing reality. This is going to be a revolution whether we like it or not." Powers' statement was designed to apply to the eventual transformative scientific impact of PCT, but it could just as easily have applied to the great realization of 2020. Many of us were facing the reality of personal vulnerability to illness, global interdependency, escalating mental health problems, pervasive inequality and racism, and an exponential climate crisis. At the same time, many of us realized the value of increased time with family and local neighborhoods, regular engagement with nature, the efficiency of remote digital work, and the primacy of science in the form of timely vaccine development. It seemed timely now for the development of a new volume of the handbook, one that set out the stage for PCT to contribute to many of these evolving global issues. In this volume, we aim to spell out how you, the readers, within your own fields of research and practice across science, arts, and humanities, can help shape the global developments through PCT. The first handbook had been in development for 6 years up to 2020, and its aim was to provide a contemporary scientific update on PCT for a wider audience. Many of the authors have been involved in the science of PCT for several decades, and they provided a historical perspective on their work stretching from the origins of the theory in 1950s and 1960s to the present day. Yet there have been many hundreds of single-minded contributors to PCT science and practice over the years who have tested and applied the theory. Each of these academics and practitioners has refined potentially useful insights as to how PCT can shape their area of work, accumulated a spectrum of experience, and have seen ahead to the society that respects each person's individual needs and preferences, a society that identifies problems with within conflicting priorities rather than separating good from bad. A society that is curious, determined, and yet patient in its need for change. A society that wishes to find a new perspective on itself that transcends existing plans, policies, and systems. You will find that the fundamental working principles of PCT underpin these aspirations: control, conflict, reorganization, and hierarchical organization. Couldn't resist myself. Power's expectation of revolution describes change as inevitable. However, his own theory contradicts his statement. In PCT, inevitability is relevant only when there is no control. A wind only blows the cyclist over because the cyclist does not move the handlebars to counteract the disturbance created by the wind. Revolutions happen because people make them happen. They are created. The chapters in this volume reveal the hard work and dedication that many people have demonstrated to begin to change the direction of researchers working on understanding how living things survive and indeed thrive. The contributors of Volume 2 of the Interdisciplinary Handbook of Perceptual Control Theory have invested their labor in researching and applying PCT going forward, some of whom have utilized the theory for many decades, others for whom PCT represents a new, exciting turn in their scientific or professional career. The 4 editors, Warren Mansell, Eva DeHulu, Viv Huddy, and Tom Schult, have chosen to work together across their disciplines to support the authors, and they have strived to ensure clarity and consistency in the use of PCT throughout the book, cross-referencing across chapters and to sources in the first volume, as well as grounding the work in the wider scientific and applied literature. This volume therefore provides contemporary perspectives on a scientific paradigm that is beginning to realize its potential. This preface has been organized to complement the preface of the first volume and to set the stage for this new venture. First, PCT is explained, with particular emphasis on getting the components of the control loop defined accurately, describing reorganization and its implications, and introducing the specific levels of perception proposed by powers. Second, having explained PCT is situated within the context of the history and philosophy of science. It defies a single categorization in the way that it cuts across the assumptions of an array of approaches, but essentially aligns itself with functional, phenomenological, humanistic, and constructivist approaches in its stance towards the relationship between mind and the physical world. Third, an overview of the chapters in this volume is provided. The book begins with phenomenology, the fundamental perceptual levels, consciousness, and imagination. To complement this experiential beginning, the following section shows how PCT is used to model human and machine action, interaction, and cooperation. Then, its unique perspective on the science and practice of improving health is provided across the domains of cancer care, health behavior, psychotherapeutic change, serious mental health problems, and dementia. The next chapter progresses from here to the use of PCT to support well-being in schools, and more widely to the philosophy of education. The latter chapters illuminate the breadth of PCT applied to the changing society we live in, our cultural evolution, the mentality of our leaders, our living space, active participation in the arts and theatre. We encourage you to start the journey here, as we share with you our view of why and how this theory was first developed, and how its surface simplicity, that behavior is the control of perception, conceals such rich and far-reaching ramifications. Here are some basic elements of perceptual control theory. Components of control. There are many ways to start an explanation of PCT. This is because its principles are proposed to underpin the living world. We could begin with a simple everyday example, like the preface of the first volume. For example, Goldilocks tried to get the temperature of her porridge just right by various activities, stirring it, blowing on it, or adding cold milk to cool it down. Another beginning could be to explain that control in PCT is essentially an extension of homeostasis in biology. The internal milieu of every cell in the body is controlled. variables such as temperature, salt ion concentration, oxygen, and carbon dioxide concentration, and even sugar levels need to be kept within the bounds that allow life to persist. This control proceeds continuously and automatically, with no need for learning or planning. In essence, Powers made the original proposal that certain variables that are sensed by the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and skin are also controlled. This control also proceeds continuously and automatically much of the time, and when we see it happening, we call it behavior. A third way to begin to explain PCT is to describe machines that control. We often take them for granted, but they have become essential for the technological advances that have led to our everyday life in the 21st century. The Watts governor was a device that ensured steam engines generated a constant flow of energy. Servo motors in aircraft wings control the angle of the flaps to ensure a safe landing. Fridges, freezers, air conditioning systems, and incubators all rely on control systems. The first control device in recorded history was most likely the water clock, a device in ancient Egypt that was closely related to the cistern in a domestic toilet. Powers describes it as the tank that filled itself, and he illustrates its automatic nature in this quote. It's important to notice that neither the slave nor the regulator had to know anything about why the water level varied. They didn't have to chase away thirsty birds or people throwing stones or anticipate hot, dry winds. All either one had to do was to sense and affect the very thing that was supposed to be controlled, the water level. The slave sensed it by looking, the machine sensed it with a float. If the water level went below the right level, the regulator, human or mechanical, was internally connected so as to open the valve until the intended level was restored, then to adjust the valve to maintain that level. The valve was being opened or closed as a means of controlling the sensed or perceived water level, since that is all the slave or machine knew about the actual water level. We can say that the actions were the means by which either the slave or the machine controlled a perception of the water level based on the actual water level. In this quote, it is clear that Powers was comfortable to describe the workings of a controlling machine from its first-person perspective, the control of its perception, in a sense personifying the machine. This doesn't mean that the machine was conscious, but only that it controls a function of its inputs. For example, if the sensor in an air conditioning system is designed incorrectly, it won't control the temperature of the room effectively. Control is by default control of input. Yet the scientific advance of PCT is not merely to illustrate the principle of control, it is to precisely describe the closed loop of functions and connections that the nervous system, body, and environment form in order for control to happen. To clarify this explanation, we have the authors of this book have reproduced the diagram of the fundamental unit of PCT, the control system. This is a diagram of the control unit, which within PCT adapted from Powers' original drawing, which was redrawn by Dag Forsell and modified by Phil Farrell and Warren Mansell. In a classic paper, Rick Markin points out that to define behavior as control is not in itself a theory. It is a natural phenomenon to be explained by a theory such as PCT. This is analogous to the study of other areas of science. The origin of new species during evolution is a phenomenon to be explained by Darwin's theory of natural selection. The study of electricity requires establishing the properties of electricity to then explain through the passage of electrons between atoms. So Powers is first to be credited for establishing the phenomenon, to explain that behavior is control, and second, for establishing a detailed model of how this might work, a fundamental component of which is the closed loop shown in the diagram. In most contexts, the elements of the loop function continuously within a circle and there is no beginning or end. However, human language is generated as a linear system of words organized in a sequence. We'll be covering the sequence of level of perception in later chapters of the book. So the explanation, unlike the diagram or nervous system itself, needs to start somewhere. This will start at the input function. The input function transforms and combines its inputs from the senses to construct the perceptual signal, whose magnitude is an analog of the variable aspect of the environment that is being controlled, the controlled variable. The perceptual signal is sent to a function known as the comparator, which calculates the discrepancy between the magnitude and that of its reference signal. The reference signal is a neural specification of the desired value or goal state of the controlled variable. The discrepancy or error signal is then transformed by the output function to allow a physical action within the environment. This action counteracts the effects of the disturbances, factors in the environment that can affect the controlled variable independently of the control system itself. The actions of the system are transformed through feedback paths within the environment that are labeled complex environmental functions. Although the powers termed these the feedback function, these affect the input quality, or quantity rather, which refers to the elements in the environment that are sensed by the input function. This closes the loop. It is critical to note that in a properly functioning control system, it is the reference value that has the greatest effect in the loop, bringing the perceptual signal into close alignment with its value, and simultaneously controlling aspects of the environment via continuous adjustments in output to act against the continuous disturbances as they arise. One of the best ways to understand how the control loop works in practice is to see it working dynamically in real time. This is possible by downloading and trying out examples of live block diagrams. I'll put a link in the description below. There is clearly a significant amount of terminology to learn when understanding PCT. One way to make it clearer is to see real-world examples. For example, Markin in 2021 produced a table to illustrate how some of the everyday examples of behavior may involve specific controlled variables, with specific reference values and examples of the kinds of disturbances that would need to be counteracted to maintain control by various means. So let's, as an example, let's just say that I have a sweet tooth. I don't have a sweet tooth, my body is a temple, but let's just say I do. So the act of sweetening tea can be broken down into in the way that we understand this through PCT. So the variable that I would be trying to control for is the sweetness of the tea. The reference state might be not too sweet, but sweet enough. And the means by which I sweeten my tea is to add sugar to the tea. And the disturbances that are within my environment might be the form of sugar, like cube or granulated. Once again, this is an example produced from a table in the study of living control systems produced by Markin, Rick Markin in 2021, with the author's permission. And now let's discuss levels of perception. So levels of perception is another element or basic element of perceptual control theory, which means we're going to discuss hierarchical control. Which means that layers of parallel control systems work together to allow control of many different types of perception. Each input signal and each output signal are connected to control systems at higher and lower layers. This is how humans are able to control complex perceptions without much effort. Higher level control systems control their perceptions through varying lower level references, and higher level perceptions are composed of combinations of lower level perceptions. The lowest level receives input from the sensory nerve endings, and each subsequent level combines these perceptual signals into perceptions of a different kind, thus creating a hierarchy in which, at every next level, Many perceptions are combined into a single input function. Powers outlined a proposal of 11 levels of perceptual control. These are described in detail with examples in Chapter 1. But since this is the preface, let's just discuss just a little bit of a summary of these levels. So level 1 controls the intensity of sensory information. Level 2 combines the sensory information into a single sensation. Level 3 controls configurations of senses, or patterns, creating a sense of consistency in our experience. Level 4 introduces transitions between perceptions, and thus the experience of change. Level 5 unites perceptions of underlying levels into a single event. Level 6 controls how lower-level perceptions form relationships, creating the experience of perspective and causality. Level 7 organizes perceptions with shared properties into categories. Level 8 orders combinations of underlying perceptions into sequences with a fixed order. Level 9 controls program structures, such as plans, that branch out in imagination. Level 10 adds an essential part of human experience by controlling principles that govern our plans. Level 11 is the highest level in Powers' hierarchy, controlling system concepts that bind all underlying perceptions together. Powers presents his proposal of levels as a hypothesis to be tested and reorganized if needed. The structure of hierarchical control, however, is an uncontested and essential part of understanding perceptual control, conflict, and reorganization. Conflict occurs when two or more control systems have different reference values for the same perceptual variable. For example, a person may have a goal to be close to the edge of a balcony to see the view, but far away from the edge to prevent falling. Resolution of conflict between control systems at the same level depends on changes in the hierarchy. At least 3 levels are involved in conflict resolution. At the lowest level, the conflict is expressed by incompatible actions of different control systems. If you are conflicted between leaving the house and remaining inside, this would be expressed at the lower level through muscle tension, getting ready to leave and preparing to stay at the same time. At the intermediate level, the conflict is caused by incompatible reference values of 2 or more control systems, both wanting to go out and exercise and wanting to stay inside and stay warm. At the highest level, the stage for this conflict is set by the reference levels of high-level control systems, and this is where the conflict may be resolved through reorganizing and thus changing these high-level references. Wanting to exercise and stay warm are governed by the principle of keeping myself healthy, and from that level do no longer conflict. One could use new program perceptions such as dressing well and exercising or waiting until the sun comes up. By moving awareness to higher levels and reorganizing there, conflicts can be resolved and control be regained. This is the mechanism through which methods of levels therapy operates, and methods of levels is covered in many chapters of this book. It is a way of actively listening to a person describing a problem that promotes the resolution of conflict. The listener only has 2 goals: to ask about the problem and to ask about disruptions, which are surface indicators, e.g. smiles, pauses of perceptual experiences that are in the background, fleeting, or at the edge of awareness. Through a conversation of this kind, the speaker's awareness shifts to the source of conflict within the hierarchy and sustains there to allow its resolution. This occurs through a process known as reorganization. Reorganization. That was a fun one. We all have basic needs. Each of us, as individuals, are born with a genetic phenotypic inheritance of intrinsic physiological values that must be kept within acceptable limits. These are necessary to our continued survival. We're pretty lucky that we can control these. Pretty important. The most obvious of these are elements like blood pressure, core body temperature, hydration, The careful balance of these variables is known as homeostasis and involves a number of processes in the body that do not require conscious awareness to function, such as shivering when our body temperature is too low and sweating when it's too high. But there are occasions when these autonomic functions are not sufficient to deal with the disturbances to these essential variables. On such occasion, new action, such as the new program, may be required. For example, putting on a sweater when shivering has failed to get to the target temperature. If the current actions continue to fail to sufficiently reduce intrinsic error, reorganization is necessary. Powers proposed that the reorganization system achieves this in how it interacts with the learned perceptual hierarchy. Conceptually speaking, the reorganization system is orthogonal to the learned perceptual hierarchy, but is functionally coupled in a critical manner. The reorganization system is a closed-loop system in its own right. At its core is a comparator that contains the genetically specified intrinsic reference signals for variables that do not need to be learned by the individual during their own lifetime, but are essential for survival. Examples of these essential variables are body temperature and blood glucose levels, but they may also include unlearned sensory variables such as pain or the smell of a predator. Events and forces in the environment entail physiological effects within the body. These effects are transmitted to the reorganization system through neural and chemical signals. If the reorganization system comparator produces an error signal due to a discrepancy between the intrinsic value signal for a given variable and the current state of the same variable, it will generate an output signal to the learned perceptual hierarchy, which drives the process of reorganization. This process of reorganization has been described by Powers as follows. Control systems will alter their characteristics, controlling new perceptual variables in new ways. Reorganization alters the properties of the control systems involved in behavior. Such changes would alter the kinds of quantities perceived, the means of correcting error through choice of lower order reference signals, dynamical properties of control systems, and even the state of existence of a control system. As a result, of course, visible behavior would change in its character, as would experienced behavior. This visible behavior would, of course, make its effects felt in the environment, which would then, in addition to feeding back via sensory perceptions to the control systems of the learned perceptual hierarchy, feed back to the reorganization system through altering physiological states within the body. It is important to remember that the reorganization system does not specify how the learned perceptual hierarchy should be reorganized or what specific features should be reorganized in which ways. It is a blind process of trial and error. William Powers and Rick Markin noticed that the similarities between the process of reorganization and the movement of Escherichia coli bacterium. It navigates nutrient gradients by randomly tumbling to find a new direction in which to head when it senses through ingestion a drop in the gradient in the surrounding medium. As Powers explained, the reorganizing system cares only about intrinsic error, which is the same regardless of what caused it. It does not care whether the behavioral organization that eliminates intrinsic error is elegant or crude, efficient or wasteful, logical or illogical, systematic or messy, prudent or foolish, realistic or superstitious. The value system of the reorganizing system is simple. Intrinsic error is bad, and lack of intrinsic error is good. The reorganizing system is totally pragmatic. If it feels good, do it. If it feels bad, change. If change involves changing system concepts, principles, programs, relationships, events, motion, configurations, sensations, or intensities, it's all the same. Push the change button, it's the only one there is. If the result isn't good, push it again. Powers mentioned that the reorganization system is the component of perceptual control theory about which the least has been experimentally revealed, and concedes that this hypothesized system might contain more sophisticated sampling mechanisms in terms of effective behavioral organizations. This is a quote from Powers again. I have been assuming that reorganization is essentially random. It may well be random with respect to any learned scheme, of course, but that does not mean it has to be random with respect to all criteria. There is no reason the reorganizing system could not act on the learned hierarchy in maximally efficient ways, so that ineffective behaviors are quickly eliminated and effective ones quickly found. But what is the unique contribution of perceptual control theory? In 1960, Bill Powers published, open quote, a general feedback theory of human behavior across 2 papers in the journal Perceptual and Motor Skills. These papers introduce a conceptual framework of behavior which is described as a synthesis of many ideas, some of which have been in print for many years. The articles specifically highlight how Newton's theory was described before him. Powers' theory sees further because it stands on the shoulders of giants, including Norbert Wiener, Schwartz Aspie, Claude Shannon, Donald Hebb, and others. In the fuller account of PCT described in Behavior, Control of Perception, Powers cites other renowned cybernetics and systems thinkers such as Gordon Pask and Jerome Bruner. This raises the question, so as I said earlier, which is essentially what does PCT contribute beyond these broader foundational ideas described by cybernetics and systems thinking more generally? The preceding ideas that Powers cited in his early work contained more general themes of feedback, self-organization, and hierarchical structure. Indeed, these themes continue to be emphasized in general introductory texts. However, PCT differs from these frameworks because its starting point is an intrinsic, internal perspective on behavior, and from that perspective, feedback has a specific meaning. In other texts, negative feedback loop is introduced in the context of flows between resource stocks in organizations or businesses. This creates the impression that negative feedback is something out there. However, from a PCT perspective, negative feedback is how living systems control a perceptual variable via their actions in the world. This is the first unique premise of PCT, distinct from the emphasis of first-order cybernetics or other systems thinking ideas. Living systems control their perceptions. Crucially, this premise predicts the existence of perceptual variables that can be detected using the test of the controlled variable. This test is described and used extensively in Section 2 of the Handbook. While many other theories describe the importance of feedback, the variables under control are considered self-evident. For example, the location of a spot on the screen in a tracking experiment. It is seldom considered that the experimenter might make the wrong assumption about this, that the participant might not be controlling what the experimenter thinks they're controlling. While the possibility of this type of error has not escaped the grasp of second-order cybernetics, it has remained primarily epistemological point that has not been accompanied by the kind of robust alternative models offered by Powers. Emerging across the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, second-order cybernetics was defined by one of its chief founders as a shift from the study of observed systems, first-order cybernetics, to the study of observing systems, second-order cybernetics. While maintaining such fundamental cybernetic concepts as feedback and self-organization, greater emphasis compared to that of the first-order cybernetics was now placed upon the observer dependence of any description of behavior, scientific or otherwise, thus eliminating the erroneous assumption in first-order cybernetics that any organism's purpose could be dependably described by an external observer. Deeply intertwined with radical constructivism, second-order cybernetics is similarly grounded in a biological argument against the possibility of any true objective knowledge of the external world. In his key paper on constructing a reality, von Foerster leans into the theory of undifferentiated encoding in a manner that seems to echo Power's hierarchical schema through which increasingly abstract perceptions are literally constructed from the fundamental level of intensities. The response of a nerve cell does not encode the physical nature of the agents that caused its response. Encoded is only how much at this point on my body, but not what. End quote. Thus, for von Foister, the fundamental question arises as to how does our brain conjure up the tremendous variety of this colorful world as we experience it. This is the problem of cognition. The search for an understanding of the cognitive processes. Von Foister further formulated cognition as the endlessly recursive computation of descriptions of reality, with computation understood as any operation, not necessarily numerical, that transforms, modifies, rearranges, orders, and so on, observed physical entities, objects, or their representations, symbols. It was to this problem of cognition that von Foister and his associates devoted their efforts at his biological computer lab during its operations at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign from 1958 to 1976. While this work did not produce a generative model of behavior, while with the kind of robust precision as that developed by Powers, von Foister did conceive of the autonomy of living organisms as synonymous with regulation of regulation. Von Foister's close colleague, von Glaserfeld, was among those second-order cyberneticians who praised Powers' contribution to a modified scientific skepticism, a skepticism with a positive dimension gained by adding the notion of cognitive construction, and recognized its significance in unequivocal terms. After half a century's not undisputed but nevertheless powerful rule of a linear stimulus-response model of behavior, whose realism was so naive as to be unaware of any theory of knowledge, one cannot but celebrate the propagation of a model that clearly invites epistemological interpretation. Such a precise generative model was not something that second-order cybernetics had managed to produce on its own. The notion that perceptions are variables, as Powers put it in his book Living Control Systems 3, Volume 3, equivalent to meter readings, also has earlier parallels in the literature of second-order cybernetics. In their 1987 book, Tree of Knowledge, Huberto Mitrana and Francisco Varela describe an analogy to explain why organisms do not use representations of the world and suggest instead that organisms only correlate internal with external states. They invite their readers to imagine that they encounter a person who has always lived in a submarine. The reader is able to communicate with the person via radio and uses this to congratulate them on navigating their way past reefs that would have endangered the submariner's journey. The submariner replies that there are no reefs, that they simply observed their measures and indicators and then guided their submarine accordingly. This analogy is useful for showing, as Powers did in his 1973 book, that perceptual variables need not correspond to anything others observe, happening, or believe is relevant. Perceptions are constructed from the senses of the purposes of the perceiver to control what is important to them. In PCT, this is not mere analogy. These variables are implemented in functional models and tested against empirical data. Indeed, in Living Control Systems Volume 2, Powers makes the point that the difference between PCT and Mitrana and Varela's theory of autopoiesis is that the former can be easily tested. Again, this illustrates that while second-order cybernetics has been able to correct some of the erroneous conceptual assumptions of its first-order predecessor, it has, unlike PCT, largely failed to move beyond philosophical postulation. The chapters in this volume provide numerous examples of how PCT has been tested in empirical studies or via its use in applied settings. The next unique premise of PCT concerns the nature of these perceptual variables under control. As has been described above, living control systems control perceptual variables at different levels in a hierarchy. Without this, they would not be able to perform the feats that enable them to survive. But the first, perceptions are controlled, and the second, perceptions are controlled in a hierarchy, these premises of PCT, they are inextricably linked. The existence of perceptual variables necessitates that these must be varied in their abstraction. The fully developed notion that more abstract variables are constructed from lower, more concrete variables, and higher levels determine the references from those below, take PCT beyond the theories that existed before it, inspired its development, and have continued alongside. Chapter Overview. In this last section of the preface, the authors provide an overview of the chapters in the volume ordered into sections. The purpose of ordering the sections in this way is to first introduce the two perspectives from which Powers developed PCT: personal introspection and technical modeling. Next, we cover two critical domains in which PCT has been widely applied: health and education. Finally, taking a wider overview of societal applications, we bring together chapters, or the authors bring together chapters, on the self and society. Perception, consciousness, and imagination. This book opens with 3 chapters that explore important aspects of our experience, different types of perception, consciousness, and imagination, through the lens of perceptual control theory. The first chapter, by Evita Hulu, explains the levels of perceptual control as outlined by Powers, painting a picture of how we control our perceptions in many different ways and how the levels work together to allow for control of increasingly complex perceptions. The model of hierarchical perceptual control offers a framework for understanding many areas of knowledge and empirical results. One such area is the understanding of human consciousness that is the center of a lively debate in psychology and philosophy. Warren Mansell adds a solid PCT account of consciousness that rewards the reader with a rich perspective on why and how hierarchical control, intrinsic systems, the reorganization system, information integration, and memory work together to create and sustain the experience of consciousness. Viv Huddy and Warren Mansell then explore the branching structure of the program level and the role of imagination as outlined by Powers in 1973 in their chapter on mental simulation, showing how imagining is a way to reorganize and regain control, but also may have adverse effects when imagined solutions conflict with other controlled perceptions. Computational and mathematical modeling. The 3 chapters in this section describe the implications of using PCT to specify functional models that are applied to widely varying examples. In the chapters by Mark Parker and Philip Farrell, human movement and autonomous robots are considered. The degree of autonomy or volition in control systems are explored from differing perspectives, and each chapter integrates the principle of hierarchy to make sense of this. The chapters by Mark Parker and Viv Huddy begin to apply functional models of reorganization to observed data, which represents an important test of this aspect of PCT. These examples are coaching, performance, and psychotherapy change trajectories. Huddy's chapter models, for the first time, reorganization occurring in populations of individual people and how the reorganization principle is manifest in aggregate patterns of data. Health applications. Essentially, in placing control at the heart of life itself, Powers and in turn Tim Carey defined health as control and poor health as lack of control. Jonathan Sigger continues this logic to provide a case for taking a whole new perspective on the field of health behavior change and illustrating it with a detailed case example of how to encourage effective hand washing. Mike Reynoldson's chapter builds upon this example through considering how PCT can inform our understanding of cancer by expanding on the many ways this pervasive illness impacts upon the control of those living with the illness, their support networks, and health services. The service context takes the fore within Rob Griffith's chapter, in which he considers the themes of control and conflict that underpin mental health services, their staff, and the consumers they serve. A primary focus is how to transform services so that they truly enable and empower people within the lived experience of mental health problems to recover. Through a scientific understanding of control within PCT, the necessary shifts can in principle be made. Just like the previous chapters in this section, Griffiths provides suggestions for tangible shifts in practice and service design. Going one step further in terms of implementation, the final chapter of this section takes the reader through a clinical research program that is now in place and guided by PCT. Empowered conversations for carers and people living with dementia. Phil McAvoy and Lydia Morris describe an approach that bridges the first-person account of living with dementia with a PCT account of how dementia challenges the capacity for control and in turn how it may be restored. Empowered conversations may be one of the most exciting translational applications for PCT, but historically it is within education that first demonstrated its real-world impact. This second volume of the handbook allows us to provide an overview and future vision of this work. Schooling and education. 2 chapters in this volume focus on the application of the PCT body of knowledge to education. Shelley Roy shares with us her extensive experience as an educator and school reformer in a chapter that outlines how schools could face the current societal crises, e.g. drug abuse, discrimination, prejudice, and mental illness, through a move away from coercion and towards an understanding of both students and educators as control systems who strive to reach their goals. E2 Pikaranian explains the complex interaction of teachers and students from a philosophical standpoint, using PCT to tackle philosophical problems such as the pedagogical paradox, human freedom, motivation, and the aims of education. Together, these chapters show how PCT could help educators get a grip on the current problems in their field and provide ways for teachers to better understand and handle their responsibilities as educators. The self and society. The chapters in this section explore the social mechanisms influencing the formation of specific reference values within the perceptual hierarchies of individuals. Ted Cloak, a veteran PCT researcher with over 50 years in the field, kicks things off in a spirited fashion by casting the broadly understood folk term culture as a mosaic of interlocking reference values, which, while instantiated in the biological substrate of neuronal configurations in individual nervous systems, are posited to propagate socially through Richard Dawkins' theoretical unit of cultural information, the meme. Carrying on in this intellectually adventurous key, Brian D'Agostino reconciles PCT with a body of theory often considered antagonistic to the field, psychoanalysis. While some PCT pursuits may insist that many of the elaborate psychic mechanisms posited in psychoanalytic circles are incompatible with PCT's parsimonious theory of inner conflict, as well as the strict ban on conjectural hypothesizing as the core of methods of levels approach to therapy. D'Agostino's chapter makes a powerful case that key psychoanalytic concepts such as the inner feminine and mastery through reversal of voice can provide valuable schemas for understanding the precise manner in which individuals psychologically adapt to particular kinds of psychically challenging circumstances through reorganization. Finally, Tom Schultz's chapter introduces a novel blend of PCT, methods of levels, and applied theatre as an approach to facilitating both reorganization on a personal level and an increased understanding of the social mechanisms through which our behavior is constrained by oppressive reference values inculcated in us by powerful interests in our society and generating severe inner conflict. In a sense, this final chapter brings the section full circle by returning to the questions raised by Ted Cloakes regarding the social propagation of system and principal variables understood as culture, but now asking whether PCT can tell us something about if and how such memes can be resisted.